Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Stephanie Meeks, Regulatory Manager at Pacific Power. We welcome you here today for our third session of our Clean Energy Plan Engagement Series of 2023. We look forward to providing information with you all regarding our Clean Energy Plan and look forward to your feedback. Now over to our facilitator, Lisa, to start our presentation.
Thank you, Stephanie. And thank you again for joining us today. In order to have a better meeting experience, some tips for you, and also to emphasize this session is being recorded to make sure that those that weren't able to attend would be able to get this information as well. So if you're desiring Spanish or American Sign Language, simply navigate to interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Select ASL under Watch or Spanish under Audio. If interpretation is missing, if you don't see that icon, simply select the More icon, and that will reveal what you can click on and then navigate to those features. Use Gallery View. It's at the top of the right-hand part of your screen. If you'd like to engage in group discussion, or you'd like to be on camera if you're having a question or you'd like to make a comment. For technical support, please chat tag, and he will respond to you immediately in regards to helping you out. Questions are invited and encouraged throughout the presentation. It's most important that you're getting the information that you need and that you understand it. So we try and look in the chat and look for raised hands in regards to, if you have comments or questions, and pulling those in at the time that we're on a particular slide. So simply either raise your hand, come off of mute, chat a question, and between the entire team, we'll make sure that we're responsive. For today's agenda, we'll start off with purpose and objectives. We'll go into the clean energy plan and then resilience. We have a break scheduled, but depending on how quickly the sessions go, that break may actually be moved a little bit lower in the presentation. Then we'll go on to community-based renewable energy, resource procurement. We'll stop for public comment, and then we'll have wrap up and next steps in regards to our agenda. So going on in regards to our purpose and then ongoing objectives. So this is the Clean Energy Plan Engagement Series, and the purpose is really to provide an integrated lens on clean energy planning with expanded learning opportunities to foster a deeper understanding of programs and outreach while gathering public input. So this is sort of bringing all sorts of public outreach together, all the good information that's happening in all the other sections, and go into it even more deeply. Ongoing objectives. So today we're going to brief on the clean energy plan and the actual filing, socialize clean energy pathways, and then deepen the understanding around the subjects of community benefit indicators, community benefits and impacts advisory group, resilience, community-based renewable energy, as well as procurement and some other subjects that are covered in today's agenda. So going on to the first part of our presentation, the Clean Energy Plan, we have Joelle Stewart, who's Senior VP of Regulation and Community and Customer Solutions. Joelle?
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. And you just said my name and title, so I don't have to repeat that, but welcome everybody. Happy to have folks here on a Friday afternoon. So as she just mentioned, I am going to give a brief overview of our Clean Energy Plan filing that we made. So it is filed with the Oregon Public Utilities Commission. We made that filing at the end of May 31st. And so the commission has initiated their proceeding for review and public comment. But to kind of level set, in case you're new to this engagement series, I do want to give a brief overview of who we are. So Pacific Corp, we are a multi-state utility. We have service area across 6 different states, and we serve about 2 million customers. We serve customers in Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho as Rocky Mountain Power. And as Pacific Power in Washington, Oregon, and California. And you can see from the map, we have a pretty extensive footprint across the West. And with that comes an extensive amount of generation and transmission, as well as then the distribution system to bring that power to everybody's homes and businesses. The footprint that we have has been very beneficial to us in that it enables us to really leverage the geography and the different climates with resource diversity. And as Pacific Corp came together through several mergers decades ago, actually, we've been planning to meet all of our customer needs across all 6 states as a system. And that has led to, as I mentioned, the great benefits we've had of leading to decarbonization and the diversity of our resources and transmission over that time. So we are transitioning as a system to decarbonization by 2050 is our goal, pending reliability, affordability, and the availability of new technologies that we think are necessary in order to get there by 2050. Now for Oregon's HB 2021 and our clean energy plan has accelerated that. So next slide, please, Tag. So just a refresher on what Oregon's clean energy requirements are for emissions. We have to meet a 20% below baseline by 2030, 90% below baseline by 2035, and 100% by 2040. Our baseline is measured based on an average of 2010 and 2012 emissions on a million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So for us, you can see we start at 8.9 million metric tons and have to reduce that to 1.8 and then 0.9 MMT CO2e. So our analysis and what we filed in our clean energy plan shows that we have a couple pathways to actually get to 2030. And how we actually get there will take some additional time and processes and over the next few years in order to determine which one is most feasible and cost effective for customers by 2030. The path to get to 2040 is a little bit more complicated, and we have identified that it will require new technology. So we're not going to talk today about the pathways, the 2 pathways we've established to meet those emissions reductions targets. Those were actually addressed in the prior engagement meeting, so you can refer back to that if you want more information, or participate in one of the upcoming sessions, particularly before the Oregon Public Utilities Commission. Next slide. Tag, can you go to the next slide? There we go, thanks. So to develop our clean energy plan and the emissions portfolio strategy, we start with our total company IRP, Integrated Resource Plan, that we filed just last month for the next 20-year period. And that uses the Plexos optimization software that maximizes our portfolio based on the least cost, least risk planning opportunities. We do this for the entire system, as I mentioned, to start with. Then to develop the CEP, we've incorporated in, starting with the total system portfolio, we then incorporate in the small scale resources that are required to meet Oregon's 10% requirement by 2030. From that starting point, once we've incorporated in the estimated number of megawatts small scale, we then finalize the CEP with additional emissions pathways to achieve the 2030 and beyond targets. Next slide, please, Ted. Thanks. So there are 7 components to our clean energy plan. It begins with the focus on our community engagement and the metrics to track that progress, which are are community benefit indicators, or CBIs. In our plan, we do call those our interim CBIs because, you know, this is our initial plan. We believe it's going to take additional evaluation, engagement, experience before we can really identify what would be sort of final metrics. And then over time, I imagine those will also continue to evolve. The plan then moves into the community and system resiliency metrics, which are critical to evaluating the potential benefits of both our community-based renewable energy opportunities and then also potentially our small-scale renewable generation options that will be part of the 10% requirement by 2030. The plan then moves into the resource planning and emissions analyses. Finally, the CEP identifies the action plan for the company. So I'm going to talk for the next couple slides about the action plan. So if you want to jump to the next slide, please, Tag. Thanks. So the action plan are near-term actions that the company's identified that we need to take to help us get to not just the next clean energy plan, but to actually help get to our targets and the goals of HB 2021. So first of all, continued engagement. As I said, this is our initial plan. We think there's a lot more work to help develop what we need to do, what are the, how we can better implement within our communities, with our customers and our stakeholders and meet those goals. Community engagement will be an ongoing part of our programs and processes for the foreseeable future and probably then beyond that as well, even once we get past those interim targets. We will continue to evaluate and monitor our clean energy or our community benefit indicators. As I mentioned, we do consider them interim right now, and they will require additional refinement over time. Looking at our system and community resilience programs and the development of those efforts. And our next speaker is going to spend a lot more time talking about that. The community-based renewable energy potential study and action plan. We are looking for more customer engagement, as well as the development of a pilot for our community-based renewable energy program, CBRE. It's easier just to go to CBRE at this point, as well as a survey that will help us better gauge the interest of different communities for projects in their community. And one of our other speakers is going to spend a lot more time talking about that. And then lastly, how we leverage public funding sources to do this as cost effectively as possible for our customers right now. And then next slide, please. So some of the other actions related to kind of the resource side, complete the 2022 all source request for proposals. This is an RFP we put out last year. We are currently in the process of evaluating the bids we got in earlier this year, and we'll be issuing a short list. So this RFP was looking for resources that could come into service by the end of 2027. Following this RFP, we will move straight into another RFP in the 2023-2024 timeline, looking for resources that we can come into service by the end of 2028. We're also going to be looking at an RFP for specific small-scale renewable resources, and we have a speaker that's going to go into a lot more detail about that in today's session. We continue to look at how to expand transmission capacity in the West in order to bring all the new renewables and not emitting resources to load. The West needs to expand its transmission capacity. We've identified through the IRP a number of lines that we believe will be necessary, and we'll continue to work towards getting those constructed over the next decade or so. Develop operational procedures to dispatch natural gas resources. So our IRP identified the conversion from some of our coal resources to natural gas. We continue to believe that the natural gas resources will be an important tool to help us bridge the gap as we build out non-emitting resources to provide reliability and to do this as cost effectively as possible. But to do that in the, I say confines of meeting Oregon's emissions requirements, we're looking more closely at what those operational procedures are that we can address both Oregon's goals as well as reliability and affordability. And then lastly, continue to work on the development of an allocation methodology that meets all of our state's energy policies as new resources are developed. As I mentioned, we're a multi-state utility. We share our costs and resources across all 6 states. And this is a process that we've been undergoing for a couple years and hope to kind of wrap up here in the next 2 years with a new allocation protocol that will help us meet all of our state's policy goals. And I think that's my last slide. So thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Joelle. Really appreciate your perspective on that. And if anybody has any questions for Joelle, feel free to chat them in or raise a hand. And then we'll go on to the other slide, and we'll monitor in regards to if there is any activity regarding questions. And now we have Kevin Benson, the Director of Asset Risk, to cover resilience. Kevin?
Thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate you joining us for this presentation. And like Lisa mentioned, I'll be spending the next about 30 minutes or so talking through the resilience portion of the Pacific Core Clean Energy Plan, what our goals are with that work, and some of the progress that we've made to date, along with our next steps and our timeline for completing those. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to just start the discussion with some definitions. And so the question that we're kind of trying to answer through the work that I'll describe on the slides that follow this is, how can we go from the traditional reliability metrics defined on the left to a more comprehensive look at resilience, which is defined on the left column there. And so what we're talking about when we talk about the difference between these two ways of viewing electric system performance is that reliability is the performance of the system under normal day-to-day operating conditions. And when we're talking about resilience for our system, what we're looking at is the ability of our system to cope with large weather events, for example, or what you would see characterized in our reliability reporting as major events. So hazards that can occur that would potentially disrupt electricity service that we don't typically see in our day-to-day operations. And the goal here and what we're trying to do is go from the traditional reliability metrics to a utility resilience score that we can then combine with community resilience factors or considerations to come up with an overall combined utility community resilience score that we can then use to identify and prioritize opportunities for work to be done through some of the programs that we'll describe later during this presentation. So digging a little bit more into where we're starting from on the next slide, you'll see these 3 traditional reliability metrics, and this is our starting point for coming up with a utility resilience score. And you'll see these referred to in our regulatory filings. These are the System Average Interruption Duration Index, or SAIDI, the System Average Interruption Frequency Index, or SAIFI, and the Customer Average Interruption Duration Index. And with these metrics, they give us a look at the performance of our system in a couple of different ways. So the first one, SAIDI, this tells us for the average customer within our service territory, the average number of outage minutes they can expect to experience within a particular time period, like a year is what we'll typically look at. For the second one, SAIFI, this is the average number of outages that a customer can expect to experience within our territory, again, over whichever time period is defined. And the difference between the system average metrics there, the SAIDI and SAIFI, and then the third one, which is the customer average interruption duration index, is that this looks just at customers that have experienced an outage, and it tells us for those customers that had an outage about how long that outage took. And what this is able to do is give us some insight into the time that's required to restore an outage once it occurs for customers customers that actually do experience an interruption. And so together, these metrics give us a pretty comprehensive picture of the day-to-day performance of the grid. But there's a couple of things that they don't consider, and I'll kind of explain on the next slide here what we're trying to incorporate into that resilience metric. And so one thing to note too, as we're looking at our 2022 reliability metrics results, is we're calculating these on a census tract level. And so this is a little bit different than what you'll see in our regulatory filings, where we're usually looking at larger regions or the state overall when we're calculating these. And so you'll see on the slide, we've got SAIDI, CAIDI, and SAIFI per census tract. And then if you look at the scales that are shown here, you'll see that the numbers are a lot larger than what you would find in our annual regulatory filings and some of the other reports that come out on our reliability. And the reason for that and why we chose to go this route is because looking at the census tract level, it gives us the ability to then pull in other community resilience data, because that information is commonly available at a census tract. And so by taking our reliability data and splitting it to the census tract level that's shown here, which isn't what we normally do, we're then able to start incorporating some of those community considerations into the resilience score that we're trying to calculate. Next slide, please. So kind of talked a little bit on the previous two slides about how we're looking at our existing reliability metrics. Now I want to talk a little bit about how we're starting to bring in some of the community resilience characteristics so we can come up with that combined score. And the route that we've chosen to go for this is to use the National Risk Index score, which is produced by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. And so what this National Risk Index score does is it gives a measure of community resilience to natural disasters. And that includes data on things like social vulnerability, susceptibility to various types of hazards that could occur, and then socioeconomic data for locations. And we selected this FEMA data set because the information is available in the public domain. So if you go to the website that's shown on the slide here, or if you were to just Google FEMA National Risk Index, you'll be brought to the website for this. And they've got technical documentation which goes into detail about the source data that gets used, the calculations that were applied to come up with these scores. And so if that's of interest to you, I would encourage you to take a look at some of that documentation that is available from FEMA. The National Risk Index has two components, and on the next slide, we'll talk about one of those here. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is the Baseline Resilience Indicators for Communities, or BRIC. And so this is a community resilience score that's looking at the community as an institution or an entity. And so it's considering things like the economic and financial well-being of the community, the built environment, things like the infrastructure that's available, the types of housing that are there, the institutional capacity of local and state government agencies to prepare for and then respond to a natural disaster if it were to occur. And then also the susceptibility to specific types of natural disasters. So the score here will include rankings for things like susceptibility to an earthquake or tsunami or wildfire risk. And so particularly for us in Oregon, we'll see different types of susceptibility to natural disasters depending on where you're looking in the state. The BRIC score includes 49 total variables. So what we've got on the slide here is how those pieces of input data are grouped together. And the documentation that's available from FEMA goes into more detail about how this score was calculated. One thing I'll add here too before we go into the next score is that the baseline risk indicators score that we're looking at here, this is from the University of South Carolina Hazards, Vulnerability, and Resilience Institute. And that's the community resilience score that FEMA chose to bring into its National Risk Index. And so in addition to the documentation that's available from FEMA, there's also information available from the University of South Carolina on this scoring, which gives a little bit more detail about the variables, the data, and how that was sourced. And I guess last thing to point out here is you'll see that the maps that are shown here, it says BRIC 2015. And so the reason why the map's about 8 years old is because this is the latest version that's available through the publicly available data at the government website for this information. But the data that we're using is actually more current. That's from 2020. So although the maps are a little bit outdated, the data that's being used is from the most recent census from 2020. And then in addition to community resilience, the National Risk Index score also includes a social vulnerability score, which is shown on the next slide. And so instead of looking at a location or a community as kind of a whole institution or a single entity, the social vulnerability score is what brings in the characteristics of the people that live there. And so this brings in a few different categories of socioeconomic variables. So it looks at things like wealth and income levels, the racial and ethnic composition of the community, age distribution, the proportion of the population that has access and functional needs, and then a number of other variables that get grouped into these categories. And so the social vulnerability score combined with the community resilience score into the National Risk Index gives us a pretty comprehensive look at the resilience of the communities that we serve. And so what we're then able to do, which is shown on the next slide, is take the social vulnerability score, which we've got indicated here as SOVI, S-O-V-I, and the resilience score, which is the RAS-L rating. And we're able to match that up with the census tract level reliability information that we looked at earlier in the presentation. And so by putting together our system performance with the social vulnerability and the resilience rating, what we're able to come up with is that combined utility community resilience score. And what we found in looking at this data, you can see in the table, what we've done is we take the 5 census tracts that have the highest data ratings or the kind of lowest reliability performance, resilience performance. And we map them to their census tract social vulnerability and resilience scores. And we found a couple of different things when we were looking at this data. And on the next slide, I'll kind of talk through the results here a little bit. So the first thing that came out from looking at the resilience scores and the reliability information for all the census tracts in Oregon is that we found a weak positive correlation between electric system reliability and the increase in social vulnerability or a decrease in resilience. And so what that means is that there's a weak correlation between lower electric system reliability and the social vulnerability of the community or its resilience. What this tells us is that there is something that we need to investigate further, because although there was a weak correlation there, correlation doesn't necessarily tell us causation. And so what we're working on now is bringing in some new data sets and some additional subject matter input, and then also community input to understand a little bit more about which of these variables may be more important than others, if there's any other information that we can pull from the data that's available to us. And so when we're working through our next steps here, there's a couple of things that we're trying to accomplish. The first is that we're bringing in additional demographic information from the Census Bureau. So we'll be, in addition to what's already included in that National Risk Index score, we'll be looking at education levels, the poverty rate, and then also health rankings or health scoring that the Census Bureau calculates. And so we'll be incorporating those into the scoring that we're doing for the community resilience. And then the expectation is that we're going to come up with a kind of version 2.0 of the resilience scores based on those new data sets and the additional input that we get from subject matter experts and through these engagement meetings. In addition to bringing in new data and getting some additional feedback on the methodology that's being used, we're also applying some feedback that we've already received, which was how can we break out the census tract information to a smaller level? And the driver for that is we're trying to account for variation within communities or within a census tract where there may be, say, higher wealth or income in one part of our community compared to another. And so what we're trying to do is figure out a way where we can get a little bit more granular, a little bit more refined in how we're looking at the locations that we're serving in these communities to see if we can then attach our reliability data and the census tract level information that's available at a more granular level or smaller scale. So once we've done all of that, we're also working on how we can incorporate the scores that are going to come out of that process into project planning and prioritization for the different programs that are covered in the Clean Energy Plan that we'll hear about a little bit more later, and then also into some other programs that the company executes, like our Distribution System Planning, or DSP. And so the idea there is that we're able to use resilience scores as an additional input into the prioritization process that gets applied to those programs, with the goal being that in addition to accomplishing the other objectives of those programs, we're also able to drive resilience improvements as an outcome from those programs. And on our last slide, we'll talk a little bit about what our timeline looks like and kind of the progress that we're making. And this is also available in our Clean Energy Plan that was filed for reference if you'd like to just kind of keep track of these dates. And so we've already worked through the process of coming up with a utility resilience score that's based on the reliability data that we looked at earlier in the presentation. And we've completed the first version of the community resilience scores, and we're working right now on version 2 of that. So on track to come up with the 2.0 version of that before we move into the next steps to use that information. And so once we've completed that community resilience scoring, then we'll put those together with our utility resilience data, the reliability data, to come up with those utility community resilience scores, and then begin incorporating that into our program planning. One additional item that we are also including in our resilience analysis is looking at the major events that occurred. And so major events are typically large or long duration weather events that occur over, say, a large geographic area over several days. So things like a large winter storm or a big wind event, and they'll cause widespread outages. And so what we do is we declare those as major events. And so what the team has begun doing is looking at the major events that have occurred in our areas that are identified as higher risk for resilience, to do our root cause analysis and understand things like what's causing the major events to occur, what's causing outages during those major events. And then we're looking at how we can apply the risk drivers that come out of that root cause analysis in addition to the resilience scores into this overall prioritization process. And we're expecting to wrap that up at the, I guess basically at the end of this year, but in December of this year. One thing I'll note here too is we do show a 3/1/23 completion date of the last item, and that's actually for 2024. So I apologize for the typo there. We'll make sure we get that corrected for future presentations. But the actual incorporation of this data, once it's all kind of compiled and put together, we wouldn't see until 2024. And we'll have some additional detail on that in our next Clean Energy Plan filing as well. And yeah, I guess that kind of wraps up my topic for today. I'll hand it back over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Kevin. And Kate, thank you for raising that in regards to the date. So as you heard from Kevin, the presentation will be updated with that date correction when we're posting it to the website. So thank you for that. Any other questions for Kevin on resilience? Feel free to chat any questions that you have in or come off of mute. Oh, thank you, John, for your question. Kevin, John's question is, what is the motivation for this analysis? Is it a legislative mandate?
Yeah, and so the resilience analysis is stemming from, I guess it's an extension of the legislation to OPUC requirements. And so I think it was toward the end of 2022, we had a series of meetings with the Public Utilities Commission to go over what the resilience analysis will look like and how it should be incorporated, or I guess how it should be documented and described in the clean energy plan, and then how it would actually be applied by the utilities that are developing these clean energy plans. So I guess the answer to the question is yes, it is based on legislation and then how that's being applied by the Public Utilities Commission.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Does anybody else have any questions on the resilience section? If so, feel free to chat them in and to come off and mute. And we'll go on to the next section then, Tag. We do have one more question. So John, again, thank you for this. Kevin, will it replace reliability as a standard?
We will continue reporting on reliability as we have been historically. So there won't be a change to the way that our reliability metrics, standards, and reporting are calculated and I guess submitted. Where resilience kind of gets factors in is in addition to that. And so we still have requirements to do our reliability tracking and reporting, and those will remain in effect and will continue to do so. And so the resilience is going to be in addition to rather than a replacement for reliability tracking.
Thank you, Kevin. Kate has a question as well. So how will community members or organizations be included in this process? How will their perspectives on resilience be implemented into the plan?
Yeah, and so we've done, I guess, a couple of things there. And so we're using a few different forums to communicate this. I guess, of course, we've got this engagement meeting or this engagement series where we'll be covering resilience. We've also met with our community benefits indicators advisory group on this topic to get their input and feedback. And we're looking for additional opportunities to go out to communities within the service territory and include this into either existing or potentially new outreach events or series of meetings, depending on what the availability of those existing meetings is. And so we are actively seeking input from resilient stakeholders in the communities and kind of continuing to identify new opportunities to do that. And then for the second question about how it'll be implemented into the plan, I guess first we start by documenting the feedback that we receive, and then we review that compared to the objectives and timelines that we defined in the Clean Energy Plan. And then we look to incorporate that based on kind of where we are in the process and what the specific feedback item is. One example of that was the feedback that we received regarding variations within communities. And so the census tract level data is useful because it's commonly available for things like the socioeconomic information that we're considering, but it doesn't account for that variation that you can see within towns or within a census tract. And so that was feedback that we received in a previous presentation on this topic that we're currently working to bring into the analysis before we move to the implementation step. And we expect to do the same as we get additional feedback going forward.
Thanks for that. Tag, if you could go on to the next slide. We're doing very well on time, so we're going to skip the break for now, and we'll go to community-based renewable energy. And we have John Rush, our CBRE consultant to PacifiCorp on the line. John?
Hi, everyone. I'm John Rush, as mentioned, and I've been working with the team on developing the CBRE community-based renewable energy components of the Clean Energy Plan that we just filed at the end of May. I've been working closely with a person named Ryan Harvey, who you've seen in these forums previously. Ryan is taking some well-deserved vacation, and he's available should we need him, but we hope to let him continue on his vacation. So we'll do my best to fill in his stead. And if we need to get some specific questions answered from Ryan, we have him available. So we can go ahead and go on to the next one. Great. So what we'll cover here today is we'll give you a little bit of background on what we filed in the Clean Energy Plan related to community-based renewable energy. So that's CBREs. And hopefully everyone's comfortable now with the acronym CBRE and what it means. Community-based renewable energy is hard for me to say 3 times fast for sure. So we'll walk through a bit of an overview of what's included in the Clean Energy Plan related to community-based renewable energy. We'll spend a little bit of time talking specifically about potential study results. One of the requirements that we had was to outline what types of resources do we see out there in terms of potential to be CBREs going forward, or community-based renewable energy projects going forward. What's the capacity we're seeing there? What kind of size do we expect to see, and what kind of types? We'll walk through what we did for our initial potential study on that. And then we'll talk a little bit about the commitments and actions we made specifically to CBREs on that. So that'll be the first part of what we'll talk about here. And then we'll focus a little bit more on into what we're calling the group 2 of potential. And back to your point, Kate, great questions on the resilience piece. Resilience is definitely a theme that we're seeing. And I guess stepping back, it feels like while the legislature and the Utility Commission have grabbed onto the importance of resilience specifically, it does feel very much like a topic that's trending across the utility business in terms of that next layer of focus. So it's something that's going to be, you'll see resilience may not be just a one thing. I expect that we're going to see resilience kind of become entangled with or entwined with many of the things that we're doing. One of them will be in the context of community-based renewable energy. One of the things that will be a focus for us in terms of what we're proposing to go forward with is focusing on resilience at a community level. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and how we see that playing out. But that's hopefully that helps to kind of bring a thread through here. And then also number 3, then working into getting input on what's the best way that we can engage with our communities to understand CBRE opportunities more wholeheartedly and make sure that we have good participation. And then finally, we'll walk through what comes next. Any questions on where we're going in this next 20 to 30 minutes? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so a bit of a thick slide here. This starts off with a couple of things we'll walk through. This is just a quick summary of what's included around community-based renewable energy within the Clean Energy Plan. So the upper part just explains what is a CBRE by definition. So I'll quickly go through it just so folks have some grounding there. I think many folks have seen it before, but it is energy systems that may be combined with microgrids, storage systems, demand response measures, or energy-related infrastructure that promotes climate resiliency. CBRE projects must either 1, directly benefit communities through engagement or ownership, kind of direct ownership, or through increased resilience or community stability, local jobs, economic development, or direct energy cost savings to the people in the community. So kind of 2 prongs to be considered a community-based renewable energy project, and that is sort of ownership or sort of general resilience benefit to the community or benefits to the communities in which they serve. So with that as background and definition, there were quite a number of other regulatory requirements that came with what we needed to make sure that we covered in our filing, which we did cover, but we'll hit a bit of the high points here rather than going through all the gory details there. So we did do one of the key parts of it is to outline what potential we see in the community-based renewable energy space in our own service area, and explain kind of what we think the capacity looks like and what types of projects. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about that here in a moment, but at the highest level, we identified 95 megawatts of potential CBRE projects in the time frame between now or next year and 2030. That's sort of the size of what we see there. In addition, in the report, we spent some time going through some background that was based on our own experience, Pacific Power's own experience, as well as findings from an ODOE study, Oregon Department of Energy, going back when the legislation was passed for HB 2021 to establish the Clean Energy Plan. The legislature also directed the Oregon Department of Energy to conduct a study on small scale and community-based renewable energy projects. They did, and it was published in September of 2022. A very good background on walking through a very diverse and broad group of experts weighed in and provided support to developing that study. And it provides a really good foundation for what is small scale, what is community-based renewable energy, what are the differences, what are the nuances of them. So we took a handful of points from that and helped to weave those into our clean energy plan for context and background. Talking about the high level costs and benefits of community-based renewable energy projects. Generally, we do expect, because of the small size and pretty intensive collaboration required, that CBRE resources are likely to be substantially more costly than utility scale resources on a per megawatt basis, on a per unit basis. So we're kind of anticipating that. And then on the flip side, one of the primary goals, what's unique about the benefits of community-based renewable energy is the potential to provide local resilience. So community and local resilience. So those are some themes that we captured from that, as well as from our own experience and hearing from communities. And that's an area that we intend to spend a fair bit of time over the next several months developing and refining. Further, that 95 megawatts of potential was broken into pieces that we could feed into the Pacific Core IRP models to understand the potential impact of CBREs on our system. And we can walk through that here on the next slide. And then finally, we outlined action plans that include obviously extensive engagement, as you'll hear. It's definitely a theme that you'll be hearing throughout this presentation. So diving in now to the potential study. So the requirement was to conduct a potential study on what resources we Pacific Power see as being community-based renewable energy opportunities going forward. So we took the approach of starting off, because we didn't have time to go hire external experts on this. There was a pretty short time frame to pull this together. And we're not actually certain exactly the right way to go through this. So we started off with sort of what we did know and began with sort of an inventory informed. So we reviewed existing programs and projects, as well as new channels. And we identified 95 megawatts of future potential opportunities of projects. And it's broken into two groups. Group one are based on existing programs and anticipated projects. These are the primary programs and input channels that we have already in place. So communities, and we walked through, the filing actually goes into pretty great detail in terms of each of these pieces. The three major components here are two are on a program basis, and one is sort of more on a collaborative process. The first is the community solar program, which has been in place the last several years. And we were looking at pretty large opportunity there. It's the opportunity for those who don't have real estate, for example, to invest in more directly in actual solar projects across the state. And that has a total of 65 megawatts of potential anticipated, and over the next 5 years. The next is the Blue Sky program, which is an ongoing, long-running renewables, the ability to participate in renewable purchases that's been in place for quite some time. I'm sorry, I don't recall the exact dates on that, but in the last 10 years, I believe. And as part of that program, there's funding that's provided each year to go do local renewable projects in our communities. So this is the 4.3 megawatts from that is an extension of our experience and what we've actually been able to deliver in terms of projects that are the grant side of that program. So we expect that to also continue. And the final one is we work closely with Energy Trust to identify potential opportunities that they see. Energy Trust is also out, obviously working. They are the primary delivery for demand side management in the state of Oregon for companies like ourselves. And they do a lot of work that parallels some of what we do and is complementary to what we do. in terms of providing technical assistance to folks, on, especially in the small hydro area, and then are also working on developing, they're also focused into the resilience space. So you'll see that as a theme as we go through. So in collaboration with them, we looked at projects that they saw in their pipeline that then we cross-referenced to make sure that we were counting them once, and identified 23 megawatts of small hydro and community-focused solar. Any questions about kind of the group one piece and kind of what that represents? So again, there's a pretty extensive write-up in the CEP report around those things. If you have further questions, we provided quite a bit of background detail there. The group 2.1 is a pretty modest total capacity. As you see, it's 3.5 megawatts. So it's not a large energy component, but it's an area where we got to the 3.5 based on our experience with two things. One, we have a pilot that's already in place for doing community battery storage for resilience. And we'll talk about that in a couple of slides here in more detail. So that's, we have experience from getting feedback from direct actual applications and from going through feasibility analysis on those, on the sizing of those, as well as then there's a new grant proposal that's been out there from the Oregon Department of Energy, where we're seeing grant proposals going in around, especially around resilience as well. And the sizing of those two led us to a kind of it's an estimate for sure, but it is an estimate based on some experience. The majority of the sizes we're seeing for these types of projects are kind of 200 to 500 kilowatt systems. We're not seeing sizing of 5 or 6 megawatts at a time. And that's based partly on the nature of our service area. It's a lot of rural territory. So tends to be smaller buildings, one-off building kind of opportunities. But we reserve the right to be wrong, and we hope that we see a lot more potential there. But that was sort of the way we put it forward based on the thinking and the evidence that we had in our hands around that. But while it is somewhat small, it's an area that we expect to be spending a great deal of time, as we talked about earlier, like the focus on resilience, both from the legislature as well as sort of generally in the community, the energy community, is strong, and it's an area we need to understand better. So we're looking at, you'll hear this as another theme, is expanding into understanding opportunities like resilience hubs, which would be kind of a small connected microgrids that would be a place where you can go get power in the event of an outage happens more broadly in the area. So that's something we'll be digging into more thoroughly. Any questions on the group 1 or group 2? All right, seeing none, we can go on to the next slide. So moving on to, these are some of the highlights that we had from the action plan. So the action plan itself is sort of a 4-part one that we'll finish with today, but these are some of the themes you'll see that were in there that are just important to call out. And these are the things that we called out in terms of CBRE focused actions in the overall action plan. So the first one is resilience partnership with Energy Trust of Oregon. In fact, this is actually going to be really just improving our collaboration and extending our collaboration with ETO. We will focus certainly on resilience because there's some specific efforts that are happening within both ETO and within Pacific Power around those. But that's an area we see there being a lot of opportunity to continue to grow, where each of us are chasing certain opportunities, seeing certain opportunities, making sure that we're keeping those together. So that's both finding specific opportunities as well as learning together. So we're excited about that part. The next one down is continuing to pursue federal grant opportunities. As folks are probably pretty aware, there's been some generous funding available as a part of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill to enhance investment in grid and in energy sectors and in communities. So we're continuing to chase very large grants on that front, and those are continuing to move forward. They're being pursued at the Pacific Corp level. As we mentioned, we're a 6-state utility, really chasing some of those larger efforts across all the 6 states. But should they come to fruition, there should be great opportunities to leverage that funding into some of the CBRE type investments in the state of Oregon. So we're looking forward to that. More to come on that, but we are definitely actively and aggressively pursuing those grants, and expect them to help us extend funding into these areas, or do more with what we have. The next one down is the CBRE grant pilot, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. And that is an extension, the potential extension of a project that a program that we have in place, like pilot program we have in place, which is a battery-focused resilience pilot that we have in place, and making it a CBRE focused one. We'll talk about that on the next slide here in a moment. And then finally, updating our CBRE potential study and action plan. So over the next several months, we expect to be gathering a whole lot of information, refining our thinking around CBREs, how we target CBREs, how do we engage with communities to identify them, how do we look at funding mechanisms for them, all kinds of things. In the end, we want to make sure that we are refining and evolving our strategy around how we look at CBREs going forward, both from refining our potential study for the next round, but more importantly, like what actions do we want to take and improve on to move ahead. Any questions on some of the high points from the action plan before we dive into a few more details? Must be Friday. All right, and go on to the next one, please. All right, so as we mentioned, we have Pacific Power has an existing pilot program that is to provide battery storage for critical facilities in Oregon. So this, it's called the Community Resiliency Battery Storage Pilot. It was started and proposed by the company back in 2018. Pardon me. And the pilot aims to support study of potential installation and use of batteries for critical facilities for resilience. There's a pretty strong, a very good definition of what are critical facilities within that program that we intend to leverage, and we can make some adjustments to if needed. But it's based on the FEMA designation for critical facilities, and then some small and thoughtful additions. Feel like it's a very good foundation for us to build from. And then the pilot itself has two elements. The first is called Offering One here. And Offering One is doing feasibility studies to assess and recommend potential battery systems. It actually walks through pretty specifically what considerations, what are the things you'd want to use it for, how often do you think you'd want to use it, how long should a battery last for, how would a battery fit with other backup generation you might already have, and then walking through it literally into, what's the building configuration, what are the circuit configurations, and then getting into, and here's what a project might look like with pricing. So we found that's a really powerful offering to encourage people to begin to participate. That portion is paid for as part of the pilot. So communities can come with ideas, and after some very initial screening and helping to make sure we have the right information, work into a feasibility study. Once feasibility has been confirmed and there's been an agreement from the community to move forward, then the next stage is to offer some grant award to help fund the purchase and installation of a battery system. So that's from the experience we've had to date. We had 20 communities who were interested, 10 of which moved forward from that Offering One, went through feasibility studies. And currently we have 2 projects that are moving forward with approved projects. So that's sort of where the left side is here, which is the current one. And where we hope to go from there is to do a somewhat simple extension of that to focus more on CBREs. So the RE component of CBRE is community-based renewable energy. Battery itself for resilience doesn't meet the need. We will have to include renewable energy as a core component of what we would do for the extended pilot here. But effectively looking at the same general approach, providing feasibility study support for doing those technical analysis and feasibility analysis up front, and then grants on the back end once projects have kind of gone through their feasibility analysis. So that's our simple approach to that, is to extend kind of something we're doing and adding the renewable energy component to it. The good news is that we have a vendor in place who's been supporting us for the current pilot, and actually several of the studies that have been done included the opportunity to add renewable to that. So that's not something that would be a big stretch for our vendor to be able to support. So we expect that it shouldn't be too bad to move forward. So I see there's a question in the chat. Great question. This is sort of an interesting one. These would not be residential, most likely. Critical facilities are going to be things that are community focused. The things we've seen that have come across so far in terms of the types of areas that we've been looking for are like police stations, the fire station, an area where there's critical communications that need to be that need to have power in the event of an outage. Then in addition to that, this is sort of stepping beyond just the critical facility definition, is we've had some proposals come forward to do it for things like areas where there's a wastewater treatment plant that needs to run if should power go out, like those kinds of things. So I expect it to be a little bit leaning more towards like larger facilities, but in our case, our experience so far is that we haven't had really large, if you will. And they need to be community focused. So in terms of helping to focus it. So so universities, schools be considered critical. I think it depends. One of the things that we've seen is that there will be areas where communities will have. I'm not going to get the terminology just right. Where they're considered a gathering zone or an evacuation site, in which case, yes, they may be considered critical. There's a lot we can get into on that. And by the way, we are going to cover this in depth in our next meeting here. So does answer those first questions there, Alyssa? And this is all very much like we're also figuring this out together. This is where we expect to get a lot of input.
Hey, John, Hannah has a comment as well.
I see that.
Curious. Okay, cool.
Yep, I see the question. Great question. And in fact, the initial take on the current battery storage effort, the pilot, was really focusing on how does a battery play with an existing diesel backup generator. In fact, there is a study that was published that actually walks through that kind of in great detail. And let me take a note of that. I'll see if I can find it before we're done today to provide the link to that. It was actually a pretty fascinating read. And it does make sense to add batteries even in cases where there's already a generator backup. All right, so as mentioned, this is an area we're going to go into much more detail. Our goal is to have a bit more meat on the bone here in terms of what the proposal will look like to move forward. And then on the right is just some considerations that we have questions about, and we'll have an opportunity to possibly provide some input prior to that, and then also with something we'll be discussing during the August meeting. So the big questions we have is how should we focus our initial efforts? Where should we start? And how should we go through those considerations? The next one is, should we focus on depth or breadth? Should we try to get a lot of projects done where we're funding parts of them? Should we focus on getting a handful of projects done kind of very thoroughly? Sort of just guiding principles, guiding ideas. Utilization of resilience metrics. It's an area we've as Kevin just walked through prior to us sitting down for this section. We're evolving our resilience metrics. We expect them to be helpful. We're not exactly sure how that's going to work yet, but we definitely keep our eyes on that and how that leverages into decision-making, prioritization, all those kinds of things. Consideration of external funding opportunities. One, making sure that we're continuing to chase those, and then how do we make sure that we're evaluating opportunities with that in mind. And then the last one is something we're going to go into here in a little bit more detail. How do we gauge community interest in CBRE opportunities? And this is something we're going to talk about over the next couple of slides here. Any questions before we leave this one? And this will be a big topic for us coming in August, just FYI. Thanks for the inputs and the questions. All right, Tag, you can go ahead. So as mentioned,